He was one of the most eloquent and outspoken opponents of the illegal spying program almost from the very beginning. In early 2006, when Democratic leaders were afraid to go on television and say that the president broke the law, Bob Barr was very outspoken in the fact that he had done so and that our democracy couldn't tolerate a lawless surveillance state. And so you could look at his record and be a little more encouraged, though the prospects that there will be a Bob Barr administration are of course, quite slim. The final point that I want to underscore and put all of this in the context of is that when I first began writing about these issues and really had reached the conclusion that there was a radicalism and an extremism unleashed in our federal government that was really threatening to undermine our constitutional framework in an unprecedented way. Certainly there's been all sorts of violations before 2001, but the fundamental assault that we've seen over the last 7 years is unprecedented. When I first began writing about that, I would always write about it in the terms of these are things that are being done by the Bush administration. These are Bush-Cheney policies. And the reason for that is because I think that at first, that was actually true. Most of these programs were things that were conceived and implemented in secret with very little consultation or knowledge by anybody else, whether it be the method of interrogating or rendering people to foreign countries to be tortured or spying on Americans with no warrants or adopting these theories in the Justice Department that the president was literally above the law. These were things that were very distinctly Bush-Cheney policies because they were doing them behind a wall of secrecy, without any oversight, without any check. The citizenry, the media, the Congress really knew very little, if anything, about it. That is really no longer true. Over the past couple of years, we have learned more and more and more and more about what our government has been doing in our name. And yet we've done very little about it. We've done very little meaningfully to actually stop that. And in fact, quite the contrary has occurred. When the Supreme Court in 2006 ruled that the military commissions at Guantanamo violated our constitutional liberties and were contrary to the law, rather than taking action to stop it, the Congress got together in a very bipartisan way and overwhelmingly voted to legalize that very program. And in the process, authorized these detention methods and abolished habeas corpus. Similarly, when we learned about the fact that the president was spying on us without warrants, our Congress got together and rather than sanction him or put an end to that, they did the opposite and they passed the Protect America Act, again by bipartisan consensus, that legalized that warrantless eavesdropping program in many respects. We've continuously passed laws to immunize people who have committed war crimes or who have broken our laws at the highest levels of government, sending the signal that not only don't we object to these things, but we endorse them and encourage them and sanction them. And so what began as Bush-Cheney policies, conceived of in the dark and without very much participation, the responsibility for those has really expanded and become much more collective. They've become a bipartisan consensus in so many ways. The Democratic leadership has been aware of so much of what is going on, and even back in 2002, and has largely endorsed it and sanctioned it. The media has essentially been invisible in terms of alerting the citizenry to how radical and how dangerous and how consequential so many of these policies have been. The courts have imposed some mild limitations on some of these policies, but by and large have either turned the other way and refused to hear challenges to so many of these policies, and in many cases have endorsed some of the most extremist aspects of what the government has done. And then over the past 2-3 years, the approval that our political class has expressed for these policies has become much more overt, so that now we've debated these things out in the open. They're no longer secret policies. They're things that we're aware of and have expressed through our representatives that we want to legalize and authorize and continue, and we've now created legislative schemes that have taken these most radical Bush-Cheney policies, these assaults on our constitutional framework, and given them the stamp of approval by legislating them and authorizing them and putting them into action. And so these Bush-Cheney policies are no longer Bush-Cheney policies. They've really become American policies. And I think that's such a vital and fundamental distinction because the premises of all of these things have permeated our political class to such an extent that it's no longer, as I indicated before, really much in debate whether or not these policies ought to be uprooted. And so it's going to take much, much more than simply electing a president who, along the way in the campaign, is paying nice rhetorical tribute to the ideas that some of this needs to be undone. It's become systemic and institutional, and even a president with the will to reverse so many of these things would have an extremely difficult time doing so, let alone a president who is simply checking off the right boxes on the way to pandering and trolling for votes. And so I think that what really is required, if many of these things are going to be reversed, and we're going to start to restore the basic constitutional principles that citizens polls show overwhelmingly believe in, is not just electing new leaders who say nice things, but really a public mobilization demanding that these policies that are so distinctly un-American be reversed and be eliminated and be abolished, and that we return our constitutional framework to the form that it was always intended to be in. And that brings me back to the first point that I talked about, which is this political realignment that I think is so significant. It isn't reflected in the media, in our dominant media narrative, that this president has become unpopular to a historic degree. It isn't just the numbers alone, it's the duration of the unpopularity and the intensity of that unpopularity. And not only is he unpopular, but his political party is in shambles. The brand is as sullied as a political brand can be. And then the defining policies of this president, the war in Iraq, and much of the trust that he claimed for so long has disappeared almost completely as well. And the extent of the dissatisfaction among the citizenry is unlike anything that modern polling has ever discovered before. Something like 8 out of 10 Americans believe that the government is fundamentally or radically off course. And so there is extreme dissatisfaction among the citizenry with how our government is functioning. And so when I talk about the need to have political mobilization against these policies, that electing a leader is insufficient in and of itself, a new leader, actually it sounds daunting. But I'm optimistic about the prospects for doing so. And the realignment that I described earlier is one of the principal reasons why that's the case. You know, George Bush didn't become historically unpopular because liberals decided that they didn't like him. Liberals didn't like George Bush from the very beginning. What changed was that so many people who are not liberals have turned against the Iraq War, have turned against the defining policies of how our government is functioning. And for that reason, the numbers that approve of this president and his policies has diminished to really a constant fringe, the sort of neoconservatives represented by journals like the National Review and Weekly Standard that John McCain has to pander to in order to have any hope of maintaining an electoral base in order to win, which is why he's now paying homage to the very theories that he previously repudiated. And so I think those are very encouraging signs. And the realignment, I think, that we've seen between libertarians and liberals and many, many people who are unaffiliated with either group, who are sort of non-ideological and independent, but know that our country has gone very awry, that our government is fundamentally departing from what have always been our defining values, I think is really the key to facilitating the types of changes that are needed in order to change the landscape of civil liberties and constitutional rights, much more so than who the next president will be in January of 2009. So with that sort of optimistic note, I will conclude, and I thank you very much for listening this evening.